Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our lecture about Paneb, a Scamp, Scoundrel and Reprobate. Our story takes place in the community of workmen at Deir el-Medina, a village dedicated to the construction of the royal tomb. So this was an enclosed community. The crew that worked on the tomb was divided in two. It was called Isut, which was also the name for a ship's crew, and like a ship's crew full of oarsmen, there was a left side and a right side. This will be important later on. The exact number of people vary within each side. Generally speaking, at the beginning of a reign, it was higher when work on the tomb was more intensive, and then it would peter out, but was generally between 20 and 30 people on each side. Each side had its own foreman, each side had its own deputy, and in addition there were the scribes of the tomb that were responsible for the administration and a variety of other people. What's also important is that the foremen and the scribes of the tomb would report directly to the vizier, and in some cases directly to the king as well. So that this was a community that worked very closely with the highest echelons of Egyptian society. The foremen were responsible for work allocation, for distributing payment, and their deputies helped them. Both of them could appear in the local court, the Kenbet, as witnesses to legal and commercial oaths. They distribute the supplies and could sometimes go as go-betweens for financial transactions between the workmen. So they were very honored and respected members of the community. So, within this community, we have a document, Papyrus Salt 124, which is a letter of accusation against a foreman called Paneb. It was written by the worker of the tomb, el-Medineh, and was addressed directly to a vizier. It is made of 3 sheets of papyrus gummed together, and to understand our story, let's look a bit at the context of this papyrus and of the accusations. Unfortunately, the papyrus itself does not have a date. Various dates have been proposed. However, the most likely is within the first years of Siptah, because the accusation was made against Paneb, and this is the time when he disappears as foreman. It is entirely possible that it is earlier, possibly under Seti I. Let's have a look at our timeline. So, in the upper part, you will see the 19th dynasty is on top, and we are talking about Seti II and Siptah, which are the 2 most likely candidates, depending on whether the accusations were immediately acted upon or not, or even whether the letter was sent. Now, just to situate ourselves, we will be talking about people who lived under the pharaoh before Ramses I, Horemheb. But the main part of our story takes place in the last years of Ramses II, that's the very long bar here, under the pharaoh Merneptah's, Amenmesse, Seti II, and Siptah. We will on several occasions mention the pharaoh Ramses III, this is the 20th dynasty on the bottom, and in one case even Ramses V. So you see about the time period we are talking about. Unfortunately, we do not know exactly where this papyrus was found. It was part of the collection of a man named Salt. He was a consul in Egypt, and we know that most of his collection came from in and around Deir el-Medina. Since it concerns the inhabitants of Deir el-Medina, it's reasonable to assume that it came from there. It was addressed to a vizier. This vizier is most likely the vizier Hori, who was first mayor of Thebes and then became vizier, probably to replace one called Pare-Emheb, who is also part of our story. He has a very lovely statue here and a stela in the Museo Egizio in Turin. And in fact, it is very probably the fact that Hori became vizier, which incited el-Medineh to write his letter, because he talks about, and he talks about crimes that were committed a long time ago, so that you start wondering why he took so long to write. And it's entirely possible we will see that Paneb had several viziers in his pocket, and possibly even a king, that he was simply waiting for somebody who would actually listen. So, who was the writer of our letter? His name was Amenacht, and he says he was the son of Neb-Nefer. We have here a very lovely family tree. In blue, we have scribes of the tomb, and in yellow, we have the foreman of the right side. The reason I also included the scribes of the tomb is to illustrate something very important, that mostly both the scribe and the foreman titles were inherited. However, it did not have to be a biological son. So we have Ramos, the scribe of the place of truth, another name for Deir el-Medineh, who adopted the scribe Kenherkopshef, who became scribe in his place, who is the father of Iyi. On the other side, we have Neferhotep I, who was foreman of the right side under Horemheb. His son Neb-Nefer also became foreman after his death, married the lady Iyi, and had several children. Neferhotep II, who married a lady called Wapchet, and who did not have any of his own children. This is important. His brothers, who are found in the tomb of their father, are called Pashet, Anui, and Neb-Nefer II. Amenacht, who professes to be a brother of Neferhotep the younger, is not mentioned anywhere in the tomb of his apparent father Neb-Nefer. Now, this can be because Amenacht was simply born after the tomb was finished, and he does seem to appear in the tomb of his brother Neferhotep, where along one wall there's a list of various family members, including his brother Amen, and then the rest is unfortunately missing, which may be Amenacht. It is also entirely possible that Anui, the third brother, is a shorthand for Amenacht. The Egyptians like to have nicknames for people, and sometimes that can make attribution a bit difficult. Now, the crux of the matter is that after the death of Neferhotep, who had no children and adopted a young servant of his household called Hesi-Sunebeth, and a young man, one of his workers, called Paneb. And after his death, Paneb became foreman, and Amenacht is writing to the vizier because he thought that he should have been foreman instead. As we can see, Amenacht is not entirely without a certain stake in the matters, but to illustrate why he should now become foreman, he lists a series of crimes that Paneb committed. Let's have a look at Paneb. Just a short overview. We have Neferhotep and we have Paneb on top from his tomb. And here on the bottom, we see the second son that he adopted, Hesi-Sunebeth, who will appear again in the story. So Paneb's family may have originally not come from Deir el-Medineh at all, as his grandfather Kassa is shown on his stela offering to the gods of Elephantine, which is far in the south. And we also don't have affiliation for Kassa within Deir el-Medineh, so that it seems likely that he came from outside. Paneb's biological parents were Iyo and Nefersenut, who are also attested in Deir el-Medineh. We have some of his father's tools. It's a level to make sure that your lines are straight, your walls are straight. Nefersenut had several children. Paneb was the eldest. He had a brother named Arpeti. He had a sister whose name we do not know, who herself had a son named Paneb. So this is the second Paneb in this family. We will see there is a third. Paneb was very prolific. He married a woman called Wabet, who was the daughter of the foreman of the left-hand side, so his colleague, who was also a chantress of Amun, probably in the local Amun temple. Paneb's eldest son was called Apeti. We know that he had a son named Kassa. His second son was also called Paneb, so this is the second Paneb of the second generation. We have another son called Nemehit and another called Hednacht. We also know several of his daughters from his tomb, Hememat, Sherit something Ray, another whose name has unfortunately not survived, and another who was called something Nefret, possibly Mut Nefret or Iset Nefret. So as we can see, he had a very prolific family. What's not clear is whether he was adopted by Neferhotep after the death of Nefersenut, or whether this was a purely adult adoption because Neferhotep wanted to make him his successor. Amenacht does mention in his letter that Neferhotep raised Paneb, so it seems likely that he was adopted while he was still fairly young. So, what exactly is Amenacht accusing Paneb of? Among other things, he is accusing him of bribery. There are two words for bribery. It's called neket and ichet, something, and generally when you're talking of somebody being bribed, you said he gave something to so-and-so in order that he does or does not do something. His very first successful attempt at bribery was for his promotion. Now, we know that he was adopted by Neferhotep. He seems to have been adopted while Neferhotep was still alive, which would make sense, and thus was perfectly legitimately a successor to him. However, it seemed that that was not enough, and after Neferhotep's death, so Paneb gifted 5 servants of Amenacht's father to Paneb. So supposedly, these servants of Amenacht's father were then given to Neferhotep, who were then given to Paneb, but it seems very important to Amenacht that they were servants that had belonged to his own father. Whether these are slaves or whether these are simply the work contracts that are being gifted, a bit like you might trade or sell a football player, is unclear. Both existed in ancient Egypt in any case. 5 servants is a very generous gift, and it seems to have worked because Paneb became the foreman of the right-hand side. So we also know that he bribed a scribe called Kenherkopshef, who is very likely, because at the time we know that he was already fairly elderly, the father of his adoptive father's Neferhotep's mother. So he was more or less family. Kenherkopshef is known for taking bribes. So we know he took one from Paneb, who confirmed probably at some court proceeding what Paneb had committed in the temple of Ptah. So apparently Paneb had got him to stay silent about some crime he had committed in the temple, and Kenherkopshef then later on admitted to it. We also know that Paneb gave something to the scribe Kenherkopshef, and he took it out. We don't know what he took out. Possibly something from the records. He is also known to have taken workmen away from the tomb to work on his own and to move stones. And we know that he also accepted bribes from other people, including the workman Rahotep, who shaved the hair of the scribe Kenherkopshef, gave him a bolt of cloth 15 cubits in length, that's 7.8 meters, and 9 spools of thread after he had concealed his misdeeds. So at first it sounds as if Kenherkopshef had paid 15 cubits of cloth and 9 spools of thread for a haircut, which seems a lot, but it soon becomes clear that the haircut is part of the payment for concealing the misdeeds of the workman Rahotep. He is a character in his own right. For one thing, he seems to have been a bit of a Sheldon. His name is inscribed on a little nook in the cliffs over the tomb of Merneptah, where he would have had a good view over the construction site. And there he wrote, "This is the seat of the scribe of the tomb, Kenherkopshef." He also inscribed his seat in the rest village on the cliffs separating the Valley of the Kings and Deir el-Bahari, Hut R, which was probably his office, and there was a little stone seat there, which he also inscribed with his name. So he had his own seat, presumably nobody else was allowed to sit there. We also know that he was a bit of a fair weather friend. we have a letter from the artist and draftsman Parahotep, who complains, "What does this bad way mean in which you behave to me? I am like a donkey to you. If there is work, bring the donkey. If there is food, bring the ox. If there is beer, you do not look for me. But if there is work, you do look for me." With a nice postscriptum, "I am a man who has no beer in his house. I try to fill my belly by writing to you." But in addition to being apparently a very strong and perhaps slightly narcissistic personality, he was also a scholar. We have his library. These are over 40 papyri that belong to him, some of which he seemed to have inherited from his adoptive father. Now, unfortunately, we do not know exactly where they were found. They were found by workmen of an archaeologist, Bernard Bruyère. And they brought some of them to him, but had sold the rest. A big packet of it to an English lord called Chester Beatty. These are now in the British Museum. It's pretty certain that some of the Naunachte papyri belong to this library, and possibly a papyrus in Geneva, number 15274. It is a very eclectic collection that includes a dream book, that includes a medicinal book on how to make medicine, a hymn to the Nile we have, and we know that Kenherkopshef added to the library himself because on spaces that were left over on his papyri, he added things himself. He added 2 copies of the Kadesh poem of the Battle of Kadesh under Ramses II in his own hand, which is fairly illegible. He also wrote down several onomastica, which are vocabulary lists centered around a certain theme. So one of them is on various titles. One of them is the sons of Ramses II, and also a list of kings of the 18th and 19th dynasty up to Ramses II. And interestingly enough, he also has a king list on his offering table, which is now in the museum in Marseille. And he and Paneb, who appear to have been rather buddy-buddy, Paneb also had an offering table with a list of kings from the 18th and 19th dynasties, possibly made for him or set up for him by Kenherkopshef. We also have a little amulet that he wrote in his own hand to protect him against the demon Sahekek. A little amulet against the demon Sahekek, who is supposed to eat feces. This is a spell that's known from several other Ostrakon from Deir el-Medineh, so it was a fairly common spell. And he wrote it down on a papyrus, which would then have been rolled up and put in a little container and that he could wear around his neck. So as we see, Paneb had in him a very learned and equally corrupt accomplice. He had several accomplices among his work crew. We also know that he used them to build his own tomb. This seems to have been, however, a fairly accepted practice, as it is only commented upon when you want to show that somebody's doing something wrong, but never actually the subject of an accusation in of itself. Possibly the worst thing he did was to use workmen from the left-hand side of the tomb as well as his own. We know the vizier liked to use workmen of Deir el-Medineh for his own tomb. Both the scribe of the tomb and both foremen regularly used them for work on their own tomb. I believe the question here is not so much whether they did it, but whether they paid the people or did it during their usual work hours. We will see that he also used them for very private work, for his own, basically treating them as his own personal servants. We'll be looking at that later, and that seems to have been more of a problem. However, he also stole tools, and tools were very expensive. There was a very close watch kept on them. They were made of metal. They were counted before and after. It was in part the responsibility of the foreman to distribute them. And it's not so much that he used them, but then he didn't return them or lost them, or in one case of a chisel, which people had been looking for a month, and which he then decided to return, but he didn't return it directly. He hid it behind a stone so that it could be found. So presumably the scribes who were responsible for keeping track of the tools were not very happy with him. He is not only corrupt, he is not only a thief, he was also a very violent man, according to Amenacht. Among other things, he issued threats against his father-in-law, the foreman of the left-hand side, Hai. We know that he disrupted meetings. What's not clear is that it's called a night party, or a night meeting, if this was just a casual party between friends or if this was a work meeting. But in any case, he walked up atop a wall, threw down stones at the people during this meeting, and generally was very disruptive and eventually beat the workmen. We know that he threatened the workman Nebnufer, son of Paneb, something about bringing lamps and going with fishermen. Unfortunately, this sounds very interesting, but this part of the papyrus is very damaged. We also know that he was very prolific with the ladies. One of his sons, most Egyptologists seem to think it was Apeti, but since he's implicated, we shall see in these accusations, it seems more likely that it's one of his other sons. Let's remember that he had 3 more, including Paneb Jr., that he fled before him. So apparently Paneb was angry at his son and was running after him, and that this son reported to the gatekeepers, swearing an oath of everyone that Paneb had sex with. And these were married women. What's not clear is whether or not the sex was consensual in the cases of the married women, but we know that he had sex with the lady Tui, called Nachtenuyut, while she was married to Kenna, who was one of his workmen and accomplices. We know he had sex with a woman called Hunor, while she was the wife of Pendua. We know he had sex with another lady called Hunor, who was the wife of Hesi-Sunebef, who was his adoptive brother. And we do know that Hunor eventually divorced Hesi-Sunebef, but whether this had to do with Paneb directly or not is unclear. And we know he had sex with Hunor's daughter, Ubechet, and that she also had sex with Paneb's son, Achpeti. So this seems to have been a very interesting evening. As we said here, the sex appears to be consensual. However, we do know that he also raped women. He robbed Yayemuya of her garment and threw her on top of a wall and violated her. So his character is appearing more and more unsavory, and extended to behavior with members of his own family. We just see that he pursued his son, probably because his son wanted to accuse him. But he also did it with his adoptive father, somebody whom you would think he would be grateful to. But apparently he chased Neferhotep through the village, who then barricaded himself inside his house. 9 men came to protect Neferhotep after Paneb broke through the door with a stone, and Paneb beat the 9 men protecting Neferhotep. After which, Neferhotep went to the vizier Amenmose with a complaint against his own son, or adoptive son, and this is the only reason we can find why Amenacht might think that Paneb was not the true successor of Neferhotep. So Neferhotep complained to the vizier about Paneb's actions. Presumably, the vizier Amenmose started an investigation, after which Paneb went to a person called Messi, and Messi dismissed the vizier from office. And it is likely the only people who could dismiss a vizier from office would be possibly the second vizier, who would then complain to the pharaoh, but ultimately it is only the pharaoh. And Messi is very probably the pharaoh Amenmesse, whose name would not have been used in full because he was deposed by Seti II and was considered illegitimate. So as we see, Paneb had friends in very high places, not just the vizier Paneb, who received a gift of servants, but the pharaoh himself did Paneb's bidding. We know that after Neferhotep's death, there appears to have been strife within the family, as he's said to have prevented and announced through the village that Amennacht and his family would not be allowed to make offering to Amun at their family chapel. Now, ancient Egyptian tombs always had a chapel attached to it. In this chapel, there could be stela dedicated to certain gods as well. And in doing so, he roped in the workman Pashed, who may very possibly have been the Pashed who was Neferhotep's brother, and thus further dividing the family, and throwing rocks at them when they tried to go there. We also know that his son Apechti was assaulted in the year 1 of, we're not sure who, month 2 of the inundation, day 15. The assailant is not named, but considering that he went against his own father, that Paneb went against his own adoptive father and another one of his sons, it is entirely possible that his own father assailed him as well. We saw that Paneb stole tools, but he took it a lot further. He did not hesitate to steal from the gods themselves, or possibly violate their temples. We know that he took or did something in the temple of Hathor. That was a temple in Deir el-Medineh. Here you can see the one from Ptolemaic times, a lot later, but which most likely stood or replaced an earlier structure. We know that Kenherkopshef confirmed that he committed a crime of some sort in the temple of Ptah. And we do know that he stole incense destined for the Ennead of necropolis gods, which he divided among himself and his accomplices. He also stole from the royal tomb. He took various things from the storehouse for things meant for the burial of Pharaoh, probably Merneptah, and they were found in his possession after the burial. This included the covering of his chariot and a statue with the name of the king. We also know that he stole, probably during the funeral, an ineb oil jar and a jar of wine, after which he sat on the king's sarcophagus, presumably drinking the wine. This was extremely disrespectful, as you can imagine. He not only stole from the king's burial goods, he stole from the tomb itself. He ordered his own workmen to take stones from the work of Seti Merneptah and make them into columns for his own tomb. And this is confirmed. We'll see later exactly how, but we know this actually happened. On the left, you see a tomb of Seti II. It was probably the tomb of Merneptah, however. Interestingly enough, we do have the tomb of Paneb. There are several interesting things about the tomb, one of which is that his title is simply workman of the necropolis, or workman in the place of truth, and not foreman. So either he started early to have the resources to start his tomb and decorate it before he became foreman, or for some reason he decided not to put the title in. And as we can see, the burial chamber does not have any columns. However, we have seen that most Egyptian tombs had a chapel or forecourt in Deir el-Medineh. His has not survived. So it's unclear as to whether he ever had one, or if possibly there was another tomb of Paneb as a foreman, which would have had a forecourt and these ominous columns that he made from stone from the tomb of the pharaoh. Of course, if he's going to steal from the tomb of the king, he's also going to steal from the tomb of private people. We know he went to 3 tombs and stretched his legs with the workman Kenna. Well, tomb tourism was actually pretty common in ancient Egypt, so presumably he was doing something nefarious there. We know he cursed or defiled a tomb on the west of the royal necropolis, which had a stela. And he stole the funerary bed of the workman Nachmin. We don't know if this is the same Nachmin whose tomb we know, TT 291, who died a long time before Paneb, or if this was a Nachmin who was buried during Paneb's lifetime. It's a fairly common name. So we know that he stole his funerary bed and carried off the objects which one gives to a dead man and stole them. And either during her burial or after the tomb was finished, he took away a sergus from the tomb of Henut Mireille, who was a wife of Ramses II and probably a daughter of Seti I. He swore he didn't have it, but a search turned it up at his house. Now, either this took place during the burial festivities and he took an actual goose and did not eat it right away, or it is possible they are talking about a statue of a goose which would have represented the god Amun, which would have been covered in gold foil partially and thus be very expensive and valuable. After all this, it is not surprising that Amennacht also accuses him of murder. Depending on how you interpret it, it is possible that he was accusing him of even murdering his own adoptive father. Amennacht says that he was killed by the enemy. However, as he very blatantly accuses him of murder later on, it seems more likely that Neferhotep was killed during the unrest marking the end of the reign of Amenmesse and the beginning of the reign of Seti II. We know that the unrest reached Deir el-Medineh, and therefore it seems likely that he was somehow killed during that time. However, Amennacht is definitely accusing of Paneb of killing those men that they might not bring message to Pharaoh. So he was interrupting the lines of communication to prevent Pharaoh from finding out certain things that were happening in Deir el-Medineh. So as you have noticed, Amennacht does have a personal stake in all of this, so that some people have wondered whether the accusations are actually true. One reason is, why did he take so long to accuse Paneb? I mean, he has a very long list of things that happened in part while Neferhotep was still alive, and presumably lasted. Paneb was a foreman for a number of years. And why he would then later on decide to accuse Paneb in order to become foreman himself. Another thing, there appears to have been a division of the family, as we can see, that this may have been more of a family feud than something that actually happened. However, we do have a number of confirmations of these accusations, which make it seem likelier that the others are true as well. Now, one problem that we do have is that Paneb was foreman, and as foreman, he sat on the Kenbet, which was the court of Deir el-Medineh. Now, you can accuse a foreman, and the foreman will appear before the Kenbet. We know that he sat on the Kenbet for accusations against his father-in-law and the foreman of the left-hand side, Hai, who was accused of insulting King Seti II. But of course, it makes it a bit more difficult to accuse somebody who normally sits on the jury. So, but as I said, we do have some corroborative evidence. One thing he is accused of is using workmen and their resources for himself. He supposedly had workmen work on a plated bed, such as the one on top, for the deputy of the temple of Amun, possibly as a bribe, while their wives wove clothes for him, either Paneb or the deputy. So he took workmen who presumably were supposed to be doing something else and had them work on a bed and had their wives weave clothes, all for this deputy from whom he presumably wanted something. And we do know from absentee lists that lists the reasons for which workmen are not at work. And in the third month of the winter season, day 26 and day 27, unfortunately we don't know what year, Mary Ray and somebody else, whose name has not survived, were finishing the rope bed for Paneb. So he definitely had people stay away from work in order to finish a bed. He's also accused by el-Medineh of making the workman Nebnufer, son of Wachmos, responsible for feeding his ox for 2 months, Paneb's ox. And this is also confirmed by an absentee list, which states that Nebnufer was absent because he was busy feeding Paneb's ox. 5th month of the inundation, day has not survived, Nebnufer, son of Wachmos, was feeding Paneb's ox. There are also several absentee lists that confirm that workmen were working on Paneb's tomb and were therefore not at work. And we know that the fact that he stole stones from the tomb of Pharaoh to use in his own tomb actually happened from a deposition by someone years later under Ramses III. His name is Paneb, and he says that he's Paneb's son. Now, he's not on any of the stela or in Paneb's tomb. He may have been a younger son who, again, was born afterwards. He may have been a grandson. But this Paneb mentions that the vizier Hori had investigated the affair with the stones of the tomb, and that action was taken against Paneb. But he also accuses the superiors of not having followed up on accusations for a long time previously. So he definitely stole things from the tomb. He definitely used workmen to make things for which he then gifted to other people. And this makes it very likely that he did in fact do all the other things that el-Medineh is accusing him of. Especially the whole thing with Neferhotep, which could be confirmed through the letters that Neferhotep had written to the previous vizier. Now, was he punished? We hear from his son Paneb that it at least took a long time before somebody actually acted on these accusations. We do know that at some point he apparently received a royal pardon, as he had to take an oath where he says that if the vizier ever has to hear my name again in conjunction with crimes, then he should be busted back down to a quarryman. With that oath, he was basically saying, okay, I did all that, and I promise, I really, really promise never to do it again. However, this was before el-Medineh's letter. We know that the vizier Paneb, who had appointed Paneb, was replaced in year 1 of Siptah by Hori. Now, in year 2 of Siptah, we still have evidence of Paneb as Foreman, but 2 years later, in year 4, he is no longer in the lists of workmen. As Hori is very probably the vizier that el-Medineh wrote to, it seems likely that el-Medineh probably first waited to see if this one was going to be as corrupt as the rest, wrote to him, and then it took a while before things happened, so that sometime between year 2 and year 4 of Siptah, Paneb was removed as Foreman. Of course, it is entirely possible that he also simply died. What we do know is that el-Medineh was not made the next Foreman. So if he did send that letter in the hopes that he could now take on his brother's legacy, he was sorely disappointed, as Paneb's successor was a man named el-Medineh, who was known to have been a workman of the right-hand side. There are various punishments for crimes. Some of them include paying fines. Some of them include going into indentured servitude. Some of them include receiving a beating. Since, unfortunately, we don't have the court proceedings of Paneb's case, we do not know what happened to him. But it does seem that this rogue and reprobate, at least, was punished in some way. so that all of the memorandums concerning the fact that Amennacht had written down in his letter were investigated and punished. I hope you enjoyed this view into a little slice of life of the more nefarious side of the workmen's village of Deir el-Medineh. Don't hesitate to subscribe to our newsletter or our YouTube channel to find out more about ancient Egypt.